Our speaker is Stefaan Verhulst, who is the co-founder and Chief Research and Development Officer of the Governance Laboratory, also known as GovLab, at New York University. And with that, I will turn it over to you. He's going to speak for 35 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions, including some from our online audience as well.
Great, thanks so much, Ken, and thanks, Zeynep, for the invitation to be here. And it's meant to be a keynote, but I think keynote is too daunting to fulfill, and so I will try to turn it into more of a conversation. And as Ken said, I will try to first frame the issues in a manner that will leave many questions open, because this is clearly an emerging field. And we already heard several this morning indicating that there is an eagerness to start using private data for a variety of purposes. But given the fact that it is an emerging field, there are also many questions that are yet to be answered, and many, and that's, I guess, Ken can help us that, many methods that still need to be developed to really extract some of the value. So what I would like to do is to really frame the questions around and the practices around private data for public policy. And why don't I start without really going into any theory, with actually some examples. And I think what we really need to do in this field is try to learn from practice. And the first example is the example of what happened in 2015 in Nepal. As you all know, in Nepal, in April 2015, Nepal got hit by the worst earthquake that Nepal had ever encountered, and it also meant that many people lost their homes, many people lost their lives, and many protected monuments disappeared forever. But the devastation and also the loss of life could have been worse if not for what happened next. And that's what was unique about this, was that Ncell, which is the largest mobile phone operator of Nepal, decided to share its data in the wake of the Nepal crisis with Flowminder, who many of you know is a data intermediary that tries to make sense of a variety of data sources within the humanitarian context. So shared its data with Flowminder in order to map the in and outflow of individuals and people and groups following the earthquake, which meant that the emergency officials and the emergency and humanitarian organizations had a unique way to predict and also to realize where the needs might be highest. And so that my first example where private data, in this case call detail records, were used, were analyzed by a new kind of intermediary that has the expertise to apply its methods and science in order to provide for public value, in order to inform public policy as it relates to emergency relief. Second example is a whole different example, but a equally important example. And this is an initiative that was created by NIH, and it's called All of Us. And the initiative is to make medical science up to speed at the time of big data. And so the effort here is to collect data around 1 million individuals, so that then they can start finally understanding what are the environmental variables that can predict certain kinds of diseases, what are the likelihood that certain kinds of drugs might have certain kinds of adverse reactions for certain kinds of individuals with certain kinds of characteristics. And so this would finally mean that as a result of those kinds of insights, we would be able to move into the era which has been announced multiple times, the era of more precision medicine. Now, this is an example where multiple parties are collaborating, because in order to collect data from 1 million individuals, you obviously need to have a collaboration. You need to have several organizations, and some of the organizations are listed here, that either have access to data or have access to specific kinds of scientific insights or have specific kind of medical expertise in order to make sense of the data. And so that's another example where private data, in this case quite often data that is being collected by health providers, private data can be shared for public value creation. And the last example, just to give an overview of the breadth of the field of private data for public policy, is an example that also took place in 2015 in Belgium, where the Belgian Statistical Agency teamed up with Eurostat, and we've heard from Eurostat this morning, and with Proximus, which is the one of the telecom operators in Belgium, to really start thinking about how can we transform how we identify population density across Belgium without relying on a survey that every 10 years has to be repeated. So how can we move into a more of a nowcasting kind of environment? And so what happened here was that Proximus used its call detail record and tried to plot within 1 kilometer kind of environments the use and density of that use of its subscribers, and then compare the results with the census that had taken place in 2011, and basically showed that you can use mobile phone data to do this kind of data population density analysis. And that's obviously one way how statistical agencies can transform themselves and become more agile by partnering with private data. And so all those examples are examples of the last few years, because obviously a lot of the data that I've been talking about is data that has been radically been available and has been collected only as a result of some of these services that have been developed the last few years. And so we can talk about new data sources ranging from web search to social media, to telecom data, to ultimately also what we already discussed this morning as well, commercial transactions. Now, important to indicate is, of course, that the availability of the data is not sufficient. It's also the advances in artificial intelligence, in data science, in computing science that has made it feasible to actually make the extractions and the insights that I've been talking about. And clearly, ranging from sentiment analysis to CDR analytics to predictive analytics to natural language processing to machine learning, those are, again, quite often methodologies and scientific tools that also are quite often progressed and available within the private sector as opposed to the public sector. And so for that reason, we can talk about private data for public good, which is more than just having access to data. It's also having access to the expertise, or also having access to advances in particular kind of scientific fields. And it's also more than just sharing data. And for that reason, I've become a strong believer that what we really have to do in order to leverage the private data for public good, we really have to start thinking about new types of public-private partnership around data. And that's what, at GovLab, we have tried to analyze the last 2 years. What are those new kind of public-private partnerships for a data age where you can actually access private data and private expertise in order to create public value? And we've called this data collaboratives. And the project that we've started 2 years ago together with UNICEF is called, surprise, surprise, Data Collaboratives. And what we've tried to do here was not only to actually engage in data collaboratives, because we also have, together with UNICEF, developed a variety of efforts to extract insights from private data, but also to become more evidence-based about what works, what doesn't work, and what is really the practice of data collaboratives. And towards that end, we've tried to scan the field of current activity around sharing data. And we have created this so-called Data Collaboratives Explorer, where we have documented over more than 100 cases where private data was used for creating public insights. And so, as a result of that universe that we finally now can start analyzing, because a lot, by the way, a lot in the data field cannot be really analyzed because there's really no universe of practice that has been collected in order to then analyze and make sense of it. But now we have this universe of more than 100 examples. Is it perfect? Obviously not, but at least it's a universe to analyze. And based upon that universe, we have now extracted a variety of insights. The first insight, or at least the first reflection emerging from the Data Collaboratives Explorer, is that private data can provide public value in 5 ways. There are basically 5 value propositions that are associated with trying to access or engage with private actors around their data. The first one is obviously that private data can improve governments or anyone trying to support the public interest, can improve their situational awareness. Obviously, this is especially the case, as I've pointed in times of disaster, for instance, at the case of Nepal, where you obviously have a better, as a result of private data, can have a better situational awareness. But it's also the case when you want to try to identify baselines in order to create public policy around. So situational awareness and also understanding of how we can respond is one value proposition behind accessing private data. The second one is around public service design, and here we see a lot of opening up and partnership with private sector in cities, for instance, where cities can start leveraging private data and private expertise in order to design public services within cities, whether that is about transportation, or whether it's about providing certain kinds of services to specific kind of populations within their city. The third one is to move away, because the first 2 ones, and that's, by the way, a lot what we see in this field, is that a lot of the application of data science is descriptive. We see a lot about describing the situation, mapping the situation, right? So, but we can also see that we can start using private data to become explanatory, which is, from my point of view, the real interesting aspect, and is, again, from a social science point of view, I guess, the exciting element to also engage with private sector, where you can start developing models that explain behavior as opposed to describing behavior. And so this knowledge creation and transfer is also a clear value proposition behind private data. The fourth one is around prediction. We already had several examples, whether it's about predicting financial stress, or whether it's predicting adverse reactions to drugs, or it's predicting economic growth. Leveraging private data is, of course, another important value proposition. And then the last one is about impact assessment and evaluation, so that you can also, from a policy perspective, try to make sense of has it made any impact, or has the performance contributed to a certain level of improvement of people's lives. Now, these are the 5 value propositions. Interesting is that those can be matched with the traditional policy cycle for those who are policy wonks, where you start with agenda setting to solution identification to implementation to enforcement to adjudication to evaluation. So we can actually see that those 5 value propositions can be matched with the policy cycle in a manner that creates the assumption and the premise that indeed having access to private data can improve the policy cycle because it improves the data provision at the different parts of the policy cycle. Here, just how many of the cases that we have selected so far are dealing with one of those value propositions, and at the moment, and again, it's not the ultimate universe, of course, but at the moment we see that most of the data collaboratives that have been established are trying to focus on knowledge creation, and the second type are really focused on public service design and delivery, with then situational awareness as well. Not that much is yet happening with regard to impact assessment and evaluation. Now, the second, besides the value propositions, meaning why should we care about having access to private data, the second element that we analyzed was then, well, how is data being shared? Because there's a lot of debate about private data sharing as if it is one way to do so. And to a large extent, we have identified 6 types of data collaboratives, 6 types where data or how data is being shared, with, of course, the understanding that there are a variety of hybrids as well that use bits and pieces of those kinds of models. And they range from creating data cooperatives, to prizes and challenges, to research partnerships, to intelligence products, to just providing an API, and to ultimately also leveraging a trusted intermediary. And the interesting thing is that each of those, of course, differs with regard to the level of openness of their own data, but also differs according to the level of collaboration, right? Sometimes like the API, for instance, there you have radical openness of the data, but limited collaboration, because basically it's, anyway, everyone can ultimately download parts of the data. And in other cases like data cooperatives, there is, anyway, only openness to those who are part of the cooperative, but then there is also maximum collaboration. And I think it's important to start understanding why those different models are chosen. So let me give you just a few examples of each. For instance, in the data pooling or the data cooperatives, an example from the US is where in California they've created the California Data Collaborative around water management. And that was basically an attempt to bring all the data that private utilities have with regard to water provisions in one data pool, so that they can also then understand what are the stresses on data across the state, what are the ways to deal with that, and how can you ultimately become smarter about providing water security. And that was a clear example of data collaboration where both the state of California partnered with several private utilities, but also private companies, in order to develop this baseline of water provision in California. Prizes and challenges, various activities here. Several here in the room probably have worked with Orange with regard to their big data for development prize as well. But this is the example of the Spanish bank BBVA that on a regular basis provide access to certain kinds of data sets. Like, for instance, in this case, was basically trade data that they had gathered as a result of their banking activity, make it open, and then provide a prize to anyone who can come up with a model or an insight that contributes to public policy or contributes to improving people's lives. Or in this case, the winner was basically a model that used the data in order to assess tourism in Madrid, and then also can predict the future of tourism, for instance. Research partnership, here an example, again, MIT Laboratory for Social Machines, where there is a partnership between Twitter and MIT in order to start using Twitter data for a variety of purposes. For instance, during the elections, where there is some kind of an understanding and assessment of the main narratives and memes, which then also might predict certain kinds of electoral behavior. intelligence products, which is, of course, you could say the least collaborative and the least open to a large extent. But what we see is the creation of new intermediaries. I mean, in the past, I've argued that we actually have to start rethinking think tanks in the world and have starting to come up with data tanks where data can be used to provide ideas and insights in society. And here, JP Morgan basically has created one of those data tanks, which are very exciting from my point of view. But again, there are all kinds of limitations attached with them using the data, because they are not sharing the data, but they are making sense of the data in light of public policy, so that they actually are creating new insights around economic indicators and actually creating new economic indicators that can be used by society in addition to the official statistical indicators, leveraging the data that JP Morgan collects, and they share the intelligence that they gain from their own data with others. Google is another one of those examples where Google quite often shares the intelligence from the search queries, but does not provide access to the search queries. And so that's another kind of data sharing, but again, limited collaboration as well. API, Zillow in the US is the startup, well, it's now a larger organization that basically manages real estate information at large, and they provide an API to all their, well, not all their information, but a large part of their information that then can be used by policy officials, quite often at city level, in order to get an understanding of the housing market in their own city, for instance. And then trusted intermediary, this is an example in the past, was Real Impact, now it's merged with Dalberg, where basically they are being asked by telecom operators to act as a trusted intermediary and ultimately solicit, but also manage the request for access to certain kinds of call detail records. And so that's another example of a collaborative, meaning what I've tried to do here was not to be fully exhaustive, but at least to indicate these are the 6 models that are emerging around accessing private data, with again the caveat that there are a variety of hybrids emerging as well, but these are the types of data sharing and data partnerships that we are seeing right now with regard to accessing private data. Again, no surprise, data pooling here happens to be the most common, anyway, like 25%. And it's no surprise because data pooling quite often is more used for research activity. And I mentioned earlier that most of the quite often private sector sharing right now is quite often to create knowledge and transfer knowledge, like for instance in the pharmaceutical kind of context, and obviously that's where data pooling gets quite often used as well. But trusted intermediaries is also used on a regular basis. So the next question that we tried to answer was, so why do they share? Meaning, it's kind of, I mean, each time in the past when I explained to someone that I try to understand the field of private data sharing, they always said, well, why would they share? Meaning, this is like, anyway, nice to do, but I presume they will never give up their diamonds, especially, and I would say, I mean, I've written papers in the past, is that the more narrative around big data, and I could see that in the past, I did a lot of work in healthcare, the more newspapers were writing about data is the new oil, the more data hoarding I actually could witness, because suddenly they realized that their private data or their own data had value. And so the question is, why would they start sharing? And so what we have identified is a variety of incentives, motivations, rationales, why they engage in this kind of data collaborative work. And I call them the 6 R's in order to, for my own purpose, to remember them on a regular basis. It starts with reciprocity. Quite often, private entities are sharing data but getting something back, especially in data pools, for instance. You share data, but then you have also access to other data, like pharmaceutical are sharing clinical trial data, but they also get access to other clinical trial data. And as a result, of course, there is a level of reciprocity. Quite often also reciprocity with regard to access to expertise. Like, for instance, you may want to share your data with international organizations in order to be able to then tap into the expertise of international organizations around, for instance, crisis or potential for crisis in certain kinds of areas. And so this kind of reciprocity is an important kind of motivation. Other motivation is, of course, research and insight, but also revenue. I mean, it doesn't have to be free, right? I didn't indicate that this data sharing automatically means that there is no financial transaction, but sometimes it's at a lower cost, right? Like, for instance, satellite operators will share data, but they still will share data at a cost, but then they will not, for instance, charge the time and energy that is needed in order to actually make sense of some of the data. So there are all kinds of ways of revenue sharing, but again, you could say, why would you engage? Well, if you're a statistical agency and you can actually do population density analysis using new data sources as opposed to having expensive surveys, it might still be a cheaper proposition quite often to actually access certain kinds of private data at a certain cost than actually engaging in a specific metric. Anyway, I'm not going through all of them except for the one that was somewhat interesting to identify was that many private corporations are currently sharing data and data expertise in order to retain their data talent. Meaning many have, for instance, Facebook and others have identified that their data scientists, after a month in the corporation, suddenly realized that they applied their expertise in order to maximize advertising clicks, and that might not be their ideal purpose in life. And so many corporations now suddenly realize that if they can propose bigger challenges to their data scientists coming from policymakers or international organizations, that is a big incentive for data science expertise quite often to stay within corporations and to engage with those organizations as well. So that's another incentive. Now, it's very important to start understanding those incentives so that we ultimately can also become more systemic in doing those kinds of data collaboratives, because without understanding what's in it for private sector, it's never going to work, right? Because it has to be a win-win kind of situation. Now, obviously, there are a variety of risks, because automatically when I talk about data sharing, and I think you've been very patient, automatically about what are the risks of sharing, right? And clearly there are a variety of risks. And there's always, one of the examples that quite often gets quoted is what happened in New York City, of course. I mean, as you know, in New York City you have the Taxi and Limousine Commission, who basically collects all the data of all the services that are providing private car service. That ranges from the yellow cabs, but also Uber, and also the gamut of other apps that you have from Lyft and so on. And in 2015, TLC tried to also share that data. And so what happened within a few days of sharing the data, a few civic hackers got the data, aggregated it with other data sets, and identified certain mobility patterns from celebrities. So that you could basically say, if you want to meet a certain celebrity, that might be the best route to follow in New York City in order to have a high probability of meeting those kinds of celebrities. But they also managed to identify who went on a regular basis to gentlemen clubs, so that they basically would identify these are actually the clients of gentlemen clubs based upon the fact that they got dropped in front of gentlemen clubs. And so that obviously embarrassed, although New Yorkers are not that quick to embarrass, but at least embarrassed a few New Yorkers and upset a few with regard to sharing that data, and obviously is an indicator that there are risks with regard to de-identification. Now, again, if this would happen in a conflict zone, then the embarrassment would lead to distinction between life and death, and obviously we have to take that serious as we talk about those kinds of protections. Now, there are generally 4 types of concerns attached to those kinds of data collaboratives. The one which I already referenced to is obviously privacy and security, or the unauthorized disclosure of certain kinds of personal data or group data that can be harmful. The other one, of course, is about data quality itself, meaning clearly private data has its limitations. It's not nirvana because it has limitations with regard to representativeness of the data, which of course leads to this whole ethical debate about data invisibles, where you in certain kinds of private data you will never find data about certain kinds of population because they are not using services like other populations, right? So certain populations are not using Twitter data. If you start using Twitter data for public policy, i.e. based upon an assumption that that reflects reality, then obviously that might have certain challenges with regard to generalizability. But the other important, and I think especially if you start using private data for public policy concern, is the longevity of the data, by which I mean to what extent can you assure that you will have access to the data. Because you can have, for instance, statistical agencies, you can start developing new metrics and new services around having access to private data, but if you have no guarantee that A, the corporation is going to stay in business for a while, or that the person who gave the go-ahead is not going to be fired next month and there's going to be another person who has no clue about what the deal was, then obviously using private data for public policy could be challenging. And so that's one of the real challenges. Other challenges are, of course, cultural challenges. Quite often we're talking about profit maximization environments versus improving people's lives environment. And they in general, of course, you could say sometimes they coincide, but in other cases it's a total different culture. There's also quite often within corporations, no one is going to be promoted for sharing data quite often, right? So they're going to quite often be promoted for leveraging the data to gain a competitive edge. But if it's about sharing data for public good, quite often the incentives, the cultural incentives, are not as strong. And the same thing with competitive concerns is, of course, is that one of the concerns to sharing the data is that the data will also be used by their competitors, and hence the so-called edge that you can gain from data might be polluted. Now, there are a variety of ways to deal with that, and this morning there have already been several great suggestions on how to go about establishing what I call, and others are calling, data responsibility. And from my point of view, there are 3 critical components to establish a culture of data responsibility that would allow for more data collaboratives to take place. First of all, we have to do a risk and value assessment. Secondly, we have to come out with new methods and technologies, and then also new principles and processes. So let me focus on the risk assessment, or the value and risk assessment. Obviously, let me start with the risk assessment. Obviously, the risks of sharing data do not reside only at the sharing stage, right? The risk of sharing data resides across the data value chain. And clearly, data is not a thing. Data is a process where various activities happen. And at each level of activity, you can actually have a variety of risks that may undermine the value or may challenge the value of actually using the data. And it starts obviously at the collection stage, where you might have dirty data, where you might have inappropriate collection of data, which then, especially if you start using that data for public policy, it might be challenged, saying that why are you using the data that was collected in an inappropriate way in the first place. At the processing stage, clearly there are security concerns here. Sharing stage, clearly there are potential here for having the data to fall in hands of non-trusted parties. Analyzing stage, we had a whole debate already about biased algorithms, and then ultimately also the using stage. So at each stage, there are a variety of challenges, and we have to just become smarter about assessing those challenges and then ultimately developing mitigation strategies. Now, important to emphasize here is that we have to develop a similar methodology for assessing value. Because because we know how to assess risk, we only assess risk. And we actually never really do a rigorous assessment of the potential value, and hence the opportunity cost or the opportunity risk of not using the data in the first place. And so I think we have to really spend more time on actually developing value assessment tools that can then determine whether it makes sense to leverage the data, and then we should start there, because if you cannot express what the benefit and the value would be of actually leveraging the data, then obviously my recommendation would be is that you probably don't even want to touch the data in the first place. So you would start with that to a large extent. Now, second element is that we obviously have to update our principles, and clearly the fair information practice principles, while they still, from my point of view, are the gold standard of information handling, but obviously they are out of date at a time of big data. Both the purpose specification aspect of the FIPS are out of date because, by the way, all what we're talking about is secondary use, and so the FIPS doesn't really allow for really secondary use as such. And same thing for the IRBs of the world that are also out of date. So we have to come up with new principles, and we don't have to adhere to one set of principles, but we have to basically spend more time. And here I referenced signal code from our colleagues from the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative that at least took the time and the effort to reflect on what should be the principles that are already basically well-established principles within the humanitarian context, and how does that apply to data, and how do you then translate that into practice, which is, of course, what I guess we're going to discuss also later this week about those principles. Same thing for the IRB, meaning Facebook has tried to come out with new processes within Facebook that would replace the IRB, in which you would have different stages of review about a review of the problem definition, so that actually it is a problem worth using Facebook data for, to ultimately reviewing the algorithms and so on. So you would have a different review process. And lastly, and again, I'm skipping here because there are many more aspects about the principles here. And lastly, we also have to come out with new methods and technologies. One is about decision trees, and again, here I'm not using automatically decision trees as in computational decision trees, but here I'm sharing what CDT has done, CDT, the Center for Democracy and Technology, where they at least have tried to come up with some kind of a decision tree as it relates to using artificial intelligence and algorithms. And basically, it's a set of questions at each stage of the process that probes you to, or probes the designer to reflect on what the implications might be of how they go about making choices. And we need more of that. We don't need, anyway, long-winded policies. I mean, you could say, well, that's what we need as well. We actually need practical kind of guidance on how you design possible data collaboratives and how you then analyze the information. And of course, there's a lot of hype these days around differential privacy, where you ultimately insert a certain kind of randomness in order to assure, from a mathematical point of view, a level of privacy. And clearly, the advances in differential privacy have been astounding. But obviously, does it provide maximum privacy? No, it provides a level of privacy, and one has to become smarter about what is the level that differential privacy provides. Okay, how do we systemize and how do we scale the use of private data for public good in a responsible manner, knowing that there are risks attached? And from my point of view, there are 4 elements that are currently missing. The first element is that the supply side, i.e. the data provider side, is totally not professionalized as it applies to sharing corporate data for public good. Anyone who, and there are many here in the audience, anyone who has tried to have access to private data, the first challenge is already, who do you ask right? And who has the authority to sign off? There's no well-established procedures within private corporations to even anticipate, yet alone handle those kinds of requests. And because there is no understanding of what a data stewardship role might be within corporations quite often. I mean, there are a few exemptions quite often. Orange, for instance, is the exemption. Facebook is trying, Bloomberg, MasterCard. So there are some exemptions where they at least have tried to professionalize the use of private data for public good, but in general, we don't see that happening. And so here, I would argue that we have to really develop a function of data stewards within corporations that can then respond to requests in a professional manner so that you know how is the request being handled. At the moment, it's quite often unclear, and it always helps to have drinks with the person at a bar, but that, I wouldn't say, is that professional, right? And so we need to establish those data stewards and create a, I would say, some kind of a collective learning among data stewards on how to do this. Secondly, we need to develop methods on how you establish data collaboratives. I mean, and those methods need to ultimately be, of course, evidence-based, which is why we started this data collaboratives initiative, so that we can learn from existing practices as opposed to start with a normative framework. This is the way you should do it, right? Let's try to become smarter about what is already happening and what works. And we need to translate that into methods on how do you establish those data collaboratives so that you can actually replicate in a variety of contexts those kinds of activities. Thirdly, we need evidence of what works. At the moment, we really don't, I mean, we have 100 plus examples, but we really don't know whether it really made an impact. I mean, in some cases you could say, well, it made an impact, it saved so many lives because now we could adjust emergency relief. In some cases you could say, well, anyway, it made somewhat of an impact. But what are metrics of success in the data space as it relates to private data for public good? We don't have those metrics right now, let alone we don't have any discussion about what that should be and how we should measure it. And then last, we need a movement. I mean, I started this work quite often, anyway, about my work when I was in my previous job, but also was a result of the work I've done around open government data, which was where we started a lot of the work at GovLab around data. And around open government data, there's a whole movement, right? There's a whole movement that tries to document what is happening. There's an index, a barometer. OECD is measuring progress towards opening up government data. There are conferences around open data. There's a research network around open data. None of that exists as it relates to private data, right? There is no indicator on what company scores higher as it relates to giving back their data to society. There is no research conference, but now Data and Policy is going to deal with that. There's no research conference that specifically focus on accessing private data, and so on. So we need a movement to really make this more systemic and really drive the access of that asset for public policy. And let me end with a few questions that I think are important to also contemplate, given the fact that this 50% of this audience are academics. I thought it might be interesting to also raise a few questions that I feel are still necessary. First one is about that we really have to develop an insight of the political economy of the data ecosystem. Quite often we assume that the data ecosystem does not reflect any power structures or has no kind of inherent kind of stresses and incentives embedded in that. So what is the political economy of the data ecosystem, and how do we go about developing a science to measure that in order to then really understand what are the potential? Second is then, how can we become more data-driven about data for policy? Now, I always make the joke, and some of you have heard about it, is that it is surprising how little data-driven we are as it relates to data. meaning we can talk about data, we have data for policy conferences, but there is little data about how data is actually being used. So how do we become more data-driven about data? Third one is, and that was also mentioned this morning, I'm going over time, is about we have to prevent the concept of data deterministic behavior. I mean, there's a lot of hype behind data as being the solution to everything, but obviously decisions are quite often still made based upon viewpoints, based upon beliefs, based upon certain kinds of values, and how do they interplay with each other, I think is important to access. And then let me end with reference to the title of this conference, is that we also have to reconcile the use of private data and also the use of private algorithms with expectations of due process as it relates to public policy. Now, if we develop public policy, we have a certain standard with regard to how data has been collected, how data has been used. But if we now start using private data, how do we reconcile those kinds of expectations? So I have no answers to those, except for saying is that we need a movement to start answering those, because then we become smarter also on how we can do and leverage private data for public policy more responsible, but also more effective. And the chair is very nervous because I went way over time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have time. We have a bit of time for questions now. We will take questions from the audience, and just keep in mind that we'll pass you a microphone so that we can hear your question. Otherwise, no one will hear it, and maybe not even us. So we got a question here.
Hi, thanks. That was an incredible talk. I teach at a master's program in computation and policy at the University of Chicago, and I have a research role at the Urban Institute. It's been in data, I think, for 49 years. And we are running into these issues left and right, both in teaching and what skills and how to show some mastery, and also starting to use this data. I have a different concern. I was wondering if you could weigh in on concerns about the reliance on private data opens new avenues for political influence of corporations. And this, I think, is particularly present in the U.S. in a week where we just saw at least some evidence of Google accepting influence in policy research as New American Foundation and so like.
Do I answer or do we collect?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, so that's clearly also a concern as to what extent if you, well, the Google example, of course, that you share was not really related to sharing data, but was, of course, financing think tanks. And then the question was, did that affect the firing of an individual who was critical, well, who not was critical of Google, but was positive about the European Commission's actions against Google. And the claim was made that as a result of the individual being positive about the European Commission's action against Google, that he was fired because Google was a funder of the New America Foundation. Well, again, there are disputes whether that was the case or not, but it was a clear example exactly of the challenge that you always have with collaborating with private actors. But that's not unique to the data space. There's, there's any kind of public-private kind of activity, you will have those kinds of challenges with regard to capture. And clearly, capture could be a challenge, but I think we need to try to at least experiment with multiple models where you keep a certain level of independence as it relates to the analysis and as it relates to the use of the information that was leveraged by private data. Are there going to be abuses? Are there going to be cases where certain insights were generated, but the corporation decided not to share the insights because it might be harmful for their own activities? Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we don't have to be naive, which is again why I call for really understanding the political economy of the data ecosystem, because that would be part of that political economy. But again, there are ways to deal with that, and again, I'm not going to elaborate on it. The transparency of the relationship is an important one. And by the way, again, this is not unique. It's like a lot of, as you all know, private sector funding of research deals with the same kind of challenges. But if you then have transparency, if you release the data and you disclose that the data comes from certain places, and that there was also other exchange of assets, that in itself might generate the transparency and then ultimately the perception of credibility, or the perception that you need to take some of the results with a grain of salt.
I'm going to get you next, but we'll get you next and then you. But let me pose a question from our online group, and I'm going to exercise my prerogative and select one. Just because I spent a weekend at a conference discussing how you do this within academia alone. How do you get the owners of various data sets to open up and share what they have when you have a culture of competition and politics that prevents that?
Yeah, well, that's, again, that's the traditional big question. And as I indicated, there are incentives for data owners, or within the context of Europe, data borrowers, to start sharing the data. And so, as I said, one strong incentive is reciprocity. Meaning you might have, and that specifically with statistical agency, for instance, right? You might have data sets, but you don't have really a mechanism to make your data generalizable if you don't have access to, for instance, administrative data. And so, or data that represents the full society. And so here, I would say the incentive quite often for instance, opening up the data is because then you actually have access to other data sets that might improve your own data set, or you have access to expertise. So that's the reciprocity thing, which is, by the way, why I don't like the term data philanthropy, because data philanthropy assumes that it's only government, private sector given something, right? I think there's clearly win-win situations to be thought of when you actually start developing data collaboratives. So that's just one incentive. I don't know, and again, I can repeat my 7 or 6 R's, but that would be one way to think about it.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have a question over here.
Thank you. Thanks for a very nice, comprehensive presentation. My question is about data interoperability. Not so much in the current environment, but in the, let's say, the situation that we will be facing in a few years from now with the Internet of Things spreading, machineries being interconnected and generating data. So if we have like various standards and various systems of metadata, will this be a technical barrier to sharing even if these other conditions are in place?
Well, yes and no. I've spent a ton amount of time and energy on developing health information exchange standards, right? And guess what? Was health information exchanged? No. And so I think it's the wishful thinking that standards will solve it, right? And so my approach, or magical thinking, was an article I once wrote. But I think standards are important, clearly, but I think you have to focus on liquidity, whether or not there are standards. And I think once you start having data being made liquid, i.e. exchanged, then you're going to figure out how you're going to mitigate certain kinds of standards. But standards are important, but don't make them magical thinking that they will solve all the problems. I think having a strong incentive and a strong problem definition and value proposition is more important than that.
Okay, we have a question over here.
Hi, it's Karsten Jung from the Bank of England. There are some examples in the financial sector where governments have decided that some data are of systemic importance and important for public policy, so they require a certain way of them being cleared, for example, derivatives, so that authorities have access to the data. So my question is, the areas that you look at, would that be an option, regulatory or supervisory access to the data?
Yes. And again, one of the R's was regulatory compliance, or at least some kind of, which I didn't touch upon. But yes, and so I think public policy officials have to start becoming more creative also on how do you provide additional kind of incentives. Because anyway, again, another big field of my past scholarship was about self-regulation and how do you actually have the market behave according to certain kinds of standards absent regulation. And the big lesson there was that clearly if there are incentives, then they will anyway have collective action. But incentives without a stick never work, i.e. you do need to have the shadow of government in order to really have the market step up and quite often have social responsible behavior. And so here I think one important role of government is to also exactly think about, anyway, are there regulatory opportunities or even conversations about if you don't do more activity in that field, we might actually develop regulations to do so, and that is quite often an incentive for corporations to then start acting socially responsible. So anyway, do I advocate for strong regulations? Probably not, but I also am not naive that there won't be market failures, i.e. that you won't have, anyway, more hoarding happening in the future as well. And so you do want to think in terms of what is the right carrot and stick kind of approach for having corporations becoming more more data collaborative. And that could be, by the way, a tax regime could be the incentive, for instance, right? And there are some examples there where you could think in terms of having some kind of information fiduciary kind of role and as it relates to taxation. But the, anyway, that would be my answer. I don't know. I could go on, but I'm going to try to have some more questions as well.
Let's see, we've got a question over here. This gentleman standing.
We have a question through Twitter. Mr. Jonathan Van Guens asked from Netherlands. The question is, what could be metrics for success of private data sharing for public good?
All right, so that's a good question. I think there are, first of all, I think we have to have a taxonomy of impact in order to then identify the metric vis-a-vis that impact. And from my point of view, there are 4 kinds of impacts that we can start thinking about. One is about, has it improved governance? By which we could mean, has it improved decisions or has it improved public service? And then for those who can have metrics, for instance, on governance, you could say, has it made it more accountable? Has it made it more effective? On service delivery, you can have metrics there as well. So that's like one area of possible impact assessment. Other area of impact relates to solving public problems. And then you could say, well, by opening up, have we made any progress on solving certain kinds of problems? And again, the discussion that we could have then is about what kinds of problems do we care, and then have, anyway, the private sector engage with the private sector around that kind of problem, and then you can measure progress vis-a-vis those kinds of problems. Other impact area could be, has it empowered individuals, for instance, in making better choices, so that they know, for instance, what hospital to go to for what kind of condition, so that you have actually an empowerment of individuals in their own decision making as a result of data, and so on. I could go on, but having a taxonomy of impact, and then within that taxonomy of impact, identifying some core metrics is really what we need to have a discussion about.
Are there any other questions? Well, that brings us right up to time. Yes? Oh, yes, sorry, we do have one more. We'll take one last question here. Sorry about that.
Yeah, my name is Mahmoud. I work for the Supreme Council for Planning in Oman. I'm not sure we are lucky or unfortunate, but let's suppose here it's private data for public policy, but imagine a setting where the government pretty much owns all infrastructure. I mean, port, airline, public transportation, telecommunication. Like, it could theoretically, in many cases, high-level policymakers sit also on boards of telecommunication companies. Shall we at first privatize them to then access private data, or shall we just access them? I mean, we could, because it's government data, kind of.
No, we should nationalize all private sector worldwide, and then, no, I'm joking. But the, well, I mean, obviously, yeah, I mean, in that case, we would talk about open government data, right? And so, as I know, the big tragedy of open government data is that quite often government officials are not using their own data. And so you can open them, but then does that mean that government officials are using their data more, right? And it turns out that actually by opening government data, you have suddenly government officials figuring out that actually there's data within government that they could use. So yeah, so in this case, I think it would be clearly an open government data strategy, and but that requires, again, a clear understanding about, anyway, what are the questions that you seek to answer. And that's, by the way, another big challenge, not only from the supply side, but also the demand side has a very hard time, public policy officials have a very hard time defining problems. And as a result, expressing what the questions are. And then if you don't have the question that is well defined, it's very hard to then engage with the data provider on why you would share the data, right? And so that's another big question.
Well, I'm afraid that's all that we have time for in this session. Thank you very much, Stefan, and for the audience.